Several months ago, I released this Kumiko Table Saw Sled that allows you to quickly and easily make grid work for Kumiko. Since then, I've been making small improvements, and this video will explore the new upgrade kit, which allows you to cut different size material. The upgrade kit consists of these new shuttles and registration keys. There are slots for 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch keys in one shuttle, and 3/16 inch in the other shuttle. Place the corresponding keys in their slots. Make sure the square tabs on the keys don't stick out on the front or back of the shuttle, as it may interfere with making accurate cuts. It's also a good idea to use some CA glue to hold these firmly in place. The long shuttles are very similar and feature the same size slots for their keys. When placing these keys in, make sure that the tab in the key is facing down and hangs over the end of the shuttle. Use a mallet to make sure that they are fully seated, but do not glue these in place as they will need to be removed to not interfere with cutting strips. To remove the key, simply lift up on the tab. If these keys are a little loose, you can add a slight bend to them to tighten their fit. This won't interfere with the spacing of the joints. Both the long and short shuttles with the 3/16 inch keys have a blank spot where you can make and add your own key if you'd like to work with a different thickness that isn't provided. Installing the new shuttles is as simple as removing the old ones and using the same hardware to attach these. If this is your first time seeing this sled, I have a previous video that goes in depth on how to assemble the sled and set it up for your specific table saw. That video is linked below if you're interested. When cutting joints in your Kumiko strips, you want your strips, registration key, and blades to be all the same thickness for best results. Here I'm going to be using 1/8 inch strips, so I'm installing an 1/8 inch thick blade. I get a lot of questions on what blade is best for Kumiko, and the short answer is it really doesn't matter. I usually use a 40-tooth alternating top bevel blade, and I get really good results. I'll start off by cutting a square grid, and for this type of grid, the blade height should be half the width of the strips. In this case, the strip width is 1/2 inch, so I'm using 2 1/8 inch strips to act as a 1/4 inch height gauge to set the height of the blade. Next, you can set the spacing of your grid by sliding the shuttle and measuring between one of the blade's teeth and the registration key. The space in between these two will dictate the open area of the final grid. I usually go between 2 and 2.5 inches for most grids. For the first cut, I like to use a scrap to line up the edge of the strips with the edge of this fence piece. And I cut 2 at first so I can check them to each other to make sure that the blade height is set correctly. They should be flush on top when they interlock together, and if they're not, you can make any adjustments to your blade height as needed. Cutting the rest of the joints with equal spacing is as simple as placing the previous cut on the registration key and making your next cut. Repeat this process as needed on all of your strips for your specific grid and project. Here I'm cutting 2 strips at the same time, and the registration keys are long enough to cut multiple strips at once, but for best results and ease of use, I like to limit that to 3 to 4 strips at most. A couple things to note when you're making any type of grid on this sled is you want to make sure that your strips are flat against the fence and flat on the sled base. This will make sure that your strips are consistent every single time. To work with other sized materials and use the other registration keys, you'll need to change your saw blade to match. Next, I'll be using 1/4 inch strips, so I'm using both the outer blades of my dado stack so that I can cut a 1/4 inch joint. After setting the blade height, I switch the shuttle around so that I can use the 1/4 inch key and set the spacing I want for this specific grid. At this point, the process is exactly the same as the other 1/8 inch strips. Assembling these grids is pretty straightforward. Place your first set of parallel strips with the joints facing up, then place your first intersecting strip on the first set of joints, and continue down the length of the strips with the following pieces. If your joints are a little tight, you can use a scrap piece of wood with a mallet to set them in place. This is what the different sized strips look like in the same sized grids. There is 1/8 inch on the left, 3/16 in the middle, and 1/4 inch on the right. We'll make hexagonal grids next, and I'm swapping out the blades here to use only one of the outer blades from the stack, which is 3/16 thick. To set the spacing, measure the distance between the inside of your blade's tooth and the inside of the registration key while your ruler is firmly up against the fence. Make sure the measurement is the same for both fences. There are 2 different strips needed to make the hexagonal grid. Let's start with the A pieces first. For these joints, the blade should be raised to cut 2/3 the width of the strip. Start by making your first cuts just like the other grids. With all the joints cut, move over to the other angled fence and cut over these joints to slightly change their shape. These joints should overlap perfectly, and a good way to make sure of that is to make sure that the corner created from the previous cut is lined up exactly in the center of the blade. This will make sure that the 2 cuts create a perfect centered point in the middle of the strip. If this cut is off by a little bit, your grid will still go together, just not as cleanly, and you might have some gaps. This is what the final joint should look like. For the B pieces, you need to lower the blade to cut through 1/3 the width of the strip. Make your series of cuts just like the other strips, and after making all the cuts, repeat the same process on the opposite edge of the strip. Remember to line up the end of the strip for the first cut just like before, so that these joints are directly on top of one another. I'm cutting down the strips to get all of my parts and keeping the A and B pieces together just to make sure it all stays organized. Here's a close-up of how the 3 pieces go together to form this joint. Assembling one of these grids can be a little confusing, but what I like to do is join all of the A pieces to one B piece, and then carefully flipping over and join the rest of the B pieces. When placing the rest of the A pieces, you may notice that the joints don't quite line up. You may need to squeeze the grid slightly to fit the rest of the pieces together. This doesn't distort the grid, but actually sets it into its correct shape. You can now trim off the extra length of the strips to clean up the look, but make sure to leave enough material here. If you cut these flush with the strips, there is nothing holding the outer pieces in place and they can fall out. You can glue the grid together, which is something I always recommend, and we'll cover that after making the final grid in the next step. The other type of grid you can make is a diamond shape. For this, you only need to use one of the angled fences and set the blade height to half the width of your strip. The process for this grid is the exact same as the square grids, except you're using the angled fence instead of the square fence. These joints are just angled half-lap joints. Assembling this grid is the exact same as assembling the square grids. One cool thing you can do with this grid is you can use your 60-degree Kumiko jig to cut pieces to make it look like the hexagonal grid. This can be useful when designing Kumiko grids to have different types of infill patterns in different areas. One thing that I always like to do is to glue my strips together. It's easiest to line up all the strips with the same joint and spread glue in between them using a small brush. If you choose to do this, make sure you use a wood glue with a long open time, especially if you're making large panels. It's also helpful to use a wood glue that dries clear. You don't need to glue the grid, but it is best to make sure that it stays all together, and I also prefer to glue the infill pieces as well. After spending all this time working on this, you want to make sure that it stays together for many years, and spending an extra couple minutes to add glue is really worth it. This upgrade greatly improved the functionality of this sled and allows you to cut different sized pieces to better fit the aesthetic of your projects. If you already own a sled, the upgrade kit is available for purchase below, and if you're planning on getting a sled, the upgraded shuttles will be included, replacing all the old shuttles in all future orders. If you're interested in learning more about Kumiko, there are links to all the products I mentioned in the video description. Thanks for watching.